At first glance, 32-inch wheels might seem like a step too far, but initial tests suggest they're actually faster than 29ers on most terrain, even where you wouldn't expect it. They've also just scored their first major international mountain bike race victory at the Cape Epic under Felix Stierle, which makes these big wheels even more interesting. In this video, I'll walk you through all the real-world data currently available comparing 29 and 32-inch wheels. We'll start with a test from BikeTest.com, then one from Voyomag, and finally, results from John Karash, who specializes in tire rolling resistance tests. But before we jump into the tests, it's worth quickly understanding why bigger wheels might be faster. In theory, larger wheels should roll more efficiently because they smooth out bumps and reduce energy lost to tire deformation. But they're also heavier, making them slower up hills, plus they have more rotational inertia, which makes them slower to accelerate. So the big question is, which effect wins in the real world? Let's see what the data says. So the first test I'm sharing has the most variables controlled for, which makes it especially interesting. BikeTest.com used a hardtail mountain bike and simply swapped between 29 and 32-inch wheels. That meant rider position, suspension settings, and frame geometry were kept identical, making wheel size the only real factor being tested. The same tires were used on both wheel sets, with the 32-inch wheels adding about 700 grams to the overall bike weight. A 29-inch Orbea Wiz full suspension bike was also tested for comparison. This bike offered 120 millimeters of front and rear suspension travel and weighed about 2 kilograms more than the 32-inch hardtail. The test took place on a 1.5 kilometer long trail loop that included a mix of terrain: uphill single track, flowy downhill single track, technical single track, rooty sections, and a gravel path. Each section was timed individually for the two test riders. Power meter pedals were also used to ensure rider effort stayed consistent, and the downhill sections were ridden coasted only. Despite the weight penalty of the 32-inch wheels, the riders found no measurable climbing penalty. Power data and sector times were essentially identical between wheel sizes. On the flowy downhill trail, performance across all bikes was also nearly identical. Any time differences were simply too small to be considered meaningful. The route section produced a repeatable performance gain of about 3% for the 32-inch wheels, equal to roughly 1 second over a 30-second segment. Over this terrain, the 32-inch hardtail even came close to matching the speed of the 120mm full suspension bike. The biggest difference appeared on the technical single track, where the 32-inch bike was 2 to 3 seconds faster over a 32-second segment. That equates to a 6 to 9% advantage over the 29er. Overall, there wasn't a single section where the 32-inch bike performed measurably worse than the others. The 32-inch hardtail was about 4% faster than the 29-inch hardtail over the full loop, which works out to roughly 2 to 3 seconds per minute. That's a substantial margin in racing terms, especially considering cross-country mountain bike races typically last 1 to 5 hours. The 32-inch hardtail was also about 3% faster than the 29-inch full suspension bike, which works out at roughly 2 seconds per minute. The full suspension bike mainly lost time on the climbs and smoother sections, likely due to its extra weight and the slightly reduced pedaling efficiency. The key takeaway here is that the 32-inch wheels were never slower, and on the rougher sections, they were clearly faster. Voyomag also compared the lap times of bikes with 29 and 32-inch wheels. They tested a Trek Pro Caliber Gen 3 against an AVN 32-inch prototype. The Trek had 120mm of travel, while the AVN used a lefty fork modified to 90mm of travel. Both bikes ran identical tyres on the same wheel model and a comparable drivetrain. The test rider used a single power meter that was swapped between bikes for each run, and every segment was ridden 3 times per bike to ensure consistent results. The first segment was a downhill trail lasting about 5 minutes, followed by a mixed flat and hilly trail section of around 5.5 minutes, and finally an uphill paved climb lasting about 9 minutes. The largest performance difference appeared on the downhill segment, where the 32-inch bike was about 5% faster, which works out to roughly 3 seconds per minute. Meanwhile, on the mixed flat and hilly trail segment, the 32-inch setup still maintained an advantage of about 2 to 3%, or roughly 1.5 seconds per minute. Even on the uphill paved road, the 32-inch bike was still about 1.5% faster, despite the heavier wheels and tyres. In the end, Voyomag found the 32-inch bike produced faster times across every trail segment, and the test rider was actually critical of the modified lefty fork, which lacked sensitivity at the start of its travel and tended to bottom out. So perhaps this even held the 32-inch bike back. John Karash conducts tyre rolling resistance testing using the virtual elevation method, which keeps as many variables constant as possible so that the differences in power output can be attributed directly to the wheels and tyres. So far, John has tested 29 versus 32-inch wheels on 4 different surfaces, using the same Maxxis Aspen 2.4-inch tyres on both bikes. Unlike many of the other tests discussed here, he adjusts the tyre pressure on the 32-inch setup to maintain equivalent hoop stress, an approach I strongly approve of. On very smooth pavement at 30 km per hour, John measured a 5.5 watt lower rolling resistance for the 32-inch wheels. This equates to a 15% reduction in rolling resistance for the Maxxis Aspens, a larger difference than expected on such a smooth surface. On Category 1 gravel at 32 km per hour, the advantage of the larger wheels increased further. John recorded a 9 watt reduction for the 32-inch wheels. At the same power output, this corresponds to about 0.25 km per hour, or roughly a 1% speed gain. On a rougher Category 2 gravel surface at 30 km per hour, the rolling resistance dropped by 9.5 watts. Over rough cobblestones, the advantage of the 32-inch wheels was a bit more modest, with about a 6 watt reduction in rolling resistance at 30 km per hour. But overall, John saw the rolling resistance of the tyres drop on every surface, to the tune of 5 to 10 watts. Outside of their lap tests, BikeTest.com also investigated the effect of the higher rotational mass of the 32-inch wheels. Using a test rig, they measured the moment of inertia of the wheels and found the 32-inch setup to be about 33% higher than the 29-inch version. That might sound concerning at first, but because the larger wheel rotates more slowly at a given speed, the increase in rotational energy is much smaller than expected. Once the extra weight is considered, the rotational energy only ends up about 10% higher. And because the wheels make up only a small fraction of the total bike and rider mass, the real-world effect on acceleration is extremely small. BikeTest.com calculated that in a 0 to 30 km per hour sprint, the heavier 32-inch wheels would require only 3 additional watts to accelerate at the same rate, assuming a 70 kilogram rider producing around 400 watts. That's less than a 1% difference in power. In practical terms, that means the acceleration difference would be roughly 0.05 seconds, which is less time than it takes to blink your eyes. So what can we take away from all of this? While these tests aren't peer-reviewed scientific studies, the trend is surprisingly consistent. This is not only compared to each other, but similar trends show in previous 26 versus 29-inch studies. Across every comparison we've looked at, the 32ers were either the same speed or faster than the 29ers. And in some cases, especially on smooth and uphill terrain, the gains were larger than expected. With these results, gravel bikes too might just see a performance boost in the coming years. Of course, it's still early days. We need more tyres tested in different widths and at different pressures. We also need more riders and more bikes. But if these results continue to hold up, 32-inch wheels could offer a decent performance advantage to racers or those seeking a more smooth and efficient ride. I'll see you guys soon.